The posterior portion, what is known as the posterior pituitary, is also known as the neurohypophysis. And it is comprised of nervous tissue. As such, it is only responsible for releasing hormones. It does not produce its own hormones. It only releases them. The front portion is what is known as the adenohypophysis. We'll talk about that in a second. So, anterior pituitary, or the adenohypophysis. This is made of glandular tissue and produces and releases its own hormones. I'll save you some time. The posterior pituitary is the only endocrine gland we are going to talk about that does not produce its own hormones. Now, this nervous tissue is connected to the underside of the brain by a thin stem-like structure known as the infundibulum. Should have been one of the anatomical features you were responsible for in your brain anatomy next door. And it is what connects it to, up here, the hypothalamus. And so, like I said, our adenohypophysis is glandular tissue, and it produces and makes its own hormones. We can take a look at what this would look like histologically here. Not surprisingly, nervous tissue tends to stain lighter than other tissues. What might cause nervous tissues to stain lighter than other tissues? Myelin, absolutely. Myelin has some adipose basically wrapped around it. So here we have that smaller posterior pituitary, and here we see the infundibulum that would connect it to the hypothalamus. Obviously this was bent as it was put on the slide. It's not bent like that in our heads. The anterior pituitary, or adenohypophysis, is much larger. And it is basically divided into three distinct regions. There is the superior part that kind of wraps around the infundibulum, almost forming a tube-like structure around the infundibulum. So it is called the pars tuberalis. The anterior part, the part that is furthest away from the posterior pituitary, is the pars distalis. And notice, other than the location, there really isn't that much difference between the glandular tissue. However, notice right here in the middle where the two meet. This small portion of the anterior pituitary that is right next to the posterior pituitary is what is known as the pars intermedia. This is distinctly different anatomically, or let's say histologically. It has different shape, different staining tissues, and so not surprisingly produces a different hormone. From the rest of the anterior it's still anterior pituitary, it's still glandular, but it is different from the rest of the anterior pituitary and produces a different hormone than the rest of the anterior pituitary. So there's the infundibulum, the pars tubralis, pars distalis, pars intermedia. Here, we actually get to see a portion of this histologically. Over here is the primary portion of the anterior pituitary. Notice we see some nice globular, glandular type of cells within here. Back here, we see our posterior pituitary, more of the axons kind of forming stripes. And what do you think these small cells in here might be? If we think back to our nervous tissue is made up of neurons and what other type of cells? Say again? Okay, astrocytes were one of the types, as were ependymal and microglial. What were the general class of those called again? Satellite cells are one of them as well. Glial or neuroglial cells, right? Neuroglial cells. Here we have special neuroglial cells that happen to be located in the posterior pituitary. What do you think we call these neuroglial cells located in the posterior pituitary? He says, knowing full well that the answer to that is on your histology list, which I'm sure you're looking at right now. Well, then I'll wait. Say again? No. Pituocytes. Pituocytes, absolutely. All these little glial cells are pituocytes. They're the ones that are housing and storing and going to play a role in the release of the hormones from the posterior pituitary. So notice we see, say again?
Pituocytes, it's only posterior?
Yes, they're glial cells located in the posterior pituitary, exactly. Notice we can see them one other place in the classroom. Conveniently enough, on the endocrine chart, which I have rolled out for us, notice we see the pituitary gland and the infundibulum, the posterior and the anterior pituitary, and lo and behold, here they have a slice of histology, kind of like what's represented here. Notice, let's start on this side, because this side is easier. Which portion of the pituitary gland do you think this one is? Posterior. Posterior, absolutely. And so what would the cells in there be? Pituocytes. Notice both of these over here are glandular tissue, but they do look different from each other. So this little bit of exaggerated glandular tissue right next to the posterior pituitary, what part would that be? And then this would be the... Exactly. And collectively they would both be the anterior pituitary because they are glandular. So notice they show that nicely for us here. And here we see that the actual histology looks a little something like that as well. All right? Now, as I mentioned, for the longest time, the posterior pituitary was thought to be the command center for the endocrine system. But then we found out that it is actually the hypothalamus that controls the pituitary. The hypothalamus is the true center of our endocrine system. It is the command center. It is the Illuminati. It is a combination neural and endocrine organ, a portion of your diencephalon of your brain, right underneath the thalamus and all those things. And it receives a massive amount of input and information from all parts of the body, both neural and chemical, and it is the big decision maker. But its job is to control the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland is made up of two different types of tissues. So do you think it can control both parts the same way? No. So, when it comes to the posterior pituitary, which is nervous tissue, well heck, what's an easy way to control nervous tissue?
Electrical signals.
Yeah, by neural inputs, exactly. And that's what happens. The hypothalamus regulates posterior pituitary via neural regulation. Here in the hypothalamus, there are neurons whose axons travel down the infundibulum to synapse on the neurons in the glial cells here in our posterior pituitary, causing them to release their hormones. So all of the hormones produced in the posterior pituitary, and there are two that you're responsible for. What are the two hormones in the posterior pituitary that you're responsible for?
Antidiuretic and oxytocin.
Antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. And guess how both of them are regulated? Neurally via the hypothalamus. But remember we said there was one other special thing about the posterior pituitary. The other thing these neurons do is also make the antidiuretic hormone and the oxytocin. They make the hormones, transmit them down for storage in the posterior pituitary. So remember, our posterior pituitary is going to store and release the hormones, but the hormones are actually made in the hypothalamus. Yep.
So it only releases hormones and it does not produce its hormones, but it does make.
It stores them and releases the hormones. The posterior pituitary stores and releases antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. All right. However, it doesn't make antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. Those are made in the hypothalamus, transported to the posterior pituitary, where it's stored until we're ready to release them. And it's the only hormone, it's the only gland that works that way. None of the other endocrine structures we talk about, let me rephrase that. Every other endocrine structure we talk about makes and releases its own hormones. The posterior pituitary is the only thing that doesn't make its own hormones. Okay? Excellent question. Any others? All right. So let's talk then about the anterior pituitary. This is all glandular tissue. So do we necessarily want a nerve going to every single cell of a gland to tell it what to do? No. Of our two other regulatory processes, which do you think would be the easiest for controlling these glands? Okay, excitatory, inhibitory, what? Hormones, right? Basically, our hypothalamus produces two classes of hormones. Releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones. So it's either going to produce a releasing hormone or an inhibiting hormone. And it wants to send it to the anterior pituitary. And notice I said classes. Let's stick with an easy one because we've already talked about. One of the hormones we know the anterior pituitary is going to release is thyroid stimulating hormone. So, our hypothalamus can make a releasing thyroid stimulating hormone, and send it to the anterior pituitary. And if it did that, what do you think the anterior pituitary would do? Yeah, make and release more thyroid stimulating hormone. Or, our hypothalamus can produce an inhibiting thyroid stimulating hormone. Send that to the anterior pituitary. And guess what would happen if it did that?
Stop.
Yeah, we'd make and release less. How would we refer to these two classes of hormones, releasing and inhibiting? Yeah, notice these are antagonistic. Because this is going to allow us to provide very precise control. If you want to control the temperature of your house, you don't just have a heater, right? Is that heater going to be doing you a whole heck of a lot of good in a month? No, right? So you need an air conditioner and a heater. Something to bring the temperature up, something to bring the temperature down, and that will allow you to be precise. So by having these two antagonistic classes of hormones, we can control every single hormone that the anterior pituitary produces. So notice all of the hormones of the anterior pituitary, and how many are on the list that you're responsible for?
7.
All 6 of the hormones that are there on the anterior pituitary, you are going to be responsible for. They're all regulated how?
Hormonal, yeah.
There you go. Hormonally, via releasing and inhibiting hormones. Yes?
What about the melanocyte stimulating hormone?
I'm sorry, what?
What about the melanocyte stimulating?
I'm sorry, what?
What? What about
I didn't
the
hear your question, so we'll just ignore it and move on.
melanocyte stimulating hormone?
What about it?
Yeah.
Hmm?
What about it?
Yes.
I don't know.
Hmm?
You tell me.
Okay. We'll come back to it later. But you're right. That is the odd man out. We'll talk about that one later. All right. Excellent. Now, we do have one issue here. Right? After all, if we want to control this hormonally, I don't know what color you said, it's black. Do we want to just release these hormones into the blood, have it go to the heart, have it circulate throughout the entire heart, and hope eventually that it makes it back to the anterior pituitary? No, that isn't a very efficient way to do that. Kind of like with our digestive system. With our digestive system, we didn't want to take all that nutrient-rich blood, stick it straight to the heart, and then have it circulate around and hopefully eventually get to the liver. We sent it to the liver first because we had a special structure that we called the hepatic portal system, right? Well, here we have the hypophyseal portal system. Basically, these hormones are released into a capillary, and we'll call it capillary 1. That capillary of 1 then has a vein coming out of it that brings it to the anterior pituitary, where we have capillary 2. So basically, our hypothalamus hormones enter, and then they exit here. They affect the cell, which then produces its secretion. Which enters into the capillary. And then, of course, this vein then goes to the heart. And, of course, once that hormone is carried to the heart, where can it go? Everywhere. I've done a very poor job of showing you this, so let's get to the pretty pictures. As I mentioned, the hypothalamus is the true command center. Its job as this combo neural and endocrine organ is regulation. It regulates a lot of basic life functions: thirst, hunger, body temperature, limbic system. Remind me again what the limbic system was? Yeah, emotions and memory and all those kind of things that we talked about. Absolutely. Right? And because it is a combo neural endocrine organ, it kind of connects the nervous system and the endocrine system together so that our two lines of communication work together. So it is the hypothalamus that controls the pituitary gland. But as we mentioned, both sides of the pituitary gland are made of different tissues, so need to be controlled differently. Here we see that anterior pituitary. Notice our hypothalamus is producing, it's releasing and inhibiting hormones into that first capillary that then travels through the hypophyseal portal veins to the anterior pituitary, where it controls these. The anterior pituitary can then release its hormones into the blood supply, and then off it goes to the body. So every single hormone, with one exception, in our anterior pituitary is going to be controlled hormonally via releasing and inhibiting hormones. Posterior pituitary is different. As we talked about, it's controlled neurally. Not only do we make the hormones in the hypothalamus, we then ship them for storage in the posterior pituitary. But when it's time, we then neurally stimulate the posterior pituitary to release its hormones into the blood supply and off throughout the body. So, the take-home message is when we talk about all the hormones of the pituitary gland, all of them, the anterior pituitary, with the exception of the one that has the asterisk next to it, is controlled hormonally via releasing and inhibiting hormones. And the two hormones, oxytocin and an antidiuretic hormone, are controlled neurally via the hypothalamus. Now, that does bring us to one last question. And we'll go back to this picture for this. Aren't these releasing and inhibiting hormones hormones? Aren't those two classes on our list? Yeah. And what are their targets? What do the releasing and inhibiting hormones, those two classes of hormones, what do they target? Anterior pituitary, right? They target the anterior pituitary. What effects do they have? What is the effect of the releasing hormone? Yeah, make and release more hormones. What's the effect of the inhibiting hormone? Or dare I say the functions, right? Of the inhibiting hormones? Make and release less. Excellent, right? So we know the target of it. We know the function of it. How do you think the hypothalamus is regulated? Is there just one thing that tells the hypothalamus what to do? No, it's the top of the ladder. So do you think it's paying attention to neural inputs it's getting? Do you think hormones can affect it? Do you think it's checking the composition of the blood and the interstitial fluid and everything else chemically to see what's going on? Yeah, there is no just one simple control. So you can just put a big fat X through the regulation of that one, because we could spend a whole semester talking about how you control the hypothalamus. So we're not going to worry about how it's regulated because it's the top of the ladder, right? And when you're at the top of the ladder, you're not just taking one input to make your decision. You're bringing in all the inputs and making all the complicated decisions, and that's far more than we need to worry about, right? That's above our pay grade, so we'll just put a big fat X through that. All right?